Well, can you believe that today is the last Sunday of the year on the Christian calendar, or that we start a new season next year, next Sunday, with Advent's arrival? It's time to take our old salt of the earth calendars off wherever they are, but save the beautiful artwork that's there, of course, and then hang up the new salt of the earth calendars to help us orient to the rhythms of our faith walks. Time goes so quickly, and here we are again on that pivotal Sunday where we review the year that is passing, and we hope and we dream about the year ahead. Between Kingdom Tide, where we listen to Jesus' teaching about what it means to follow him and live as citizens of his kingdom, and Advent on the other side, where we celebrate Christ's coming as a baby to be human in our midst and work salvation for us, and also remember that we wait. We're waiting for the final consummation of God's redemption and that plan with Jesus' return. So right here in the middle, right on this day, we have the Reign of Christ Sunday. This is Christ the King Sunday, as it is otherwise called. It's a pivot. It's a hinge in the church year. Whether we look backward or forward, it's fitting to recall that Christ is the King, the one true eternal King. And that remembrance can encourage us and steady us, whatever our circumstances might be. I want to tell you something about pronominalization. That might be a Jeopardy cue someday, so listen to that. Pronominalization means how we use pronouns, okay? So if I said, Pastor Katie bought a new car, her new car is green, then you know that her means Pastor Katie because I set it up that way, right? But there's this thing in American Sign Language where we use pronominalization in a different way. So we describe someone and then we put them someplace in space. So here is whatever, Joe. And then anytime I'm pointing over here, the person who's reading my message remembers, she's speaking about Joe. So it's just a point in the air because I've set them up someplace. This comes in handy because recently I saw on Facebook that someone posted about that old song, There Was a Farmer Had a Dog, and Bingo was his name. And then the question was it the farmer's name that was Bingo or the dog's name that was Bingo? Because in English, we can't really tell. But in sign language, we would never be wondering that because we would describe the farmer, and we describe the dog, and so I would be pointing in different directions. Christ is King. Christ is the King. No limited scope, no place where someone truly else reigns anywhere, though it appears that sometimes the worldly powers wield control for a time. Christ is the King. The Colossians passage that we heard this morning speaks of the broad scope of salvation, the power of Christ, his supremacy over all things, the church, the world, creation, the powers of this world, thrones, dominions, all powers. In him, Jesus, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him, God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of the cross. Peace through the blood of the cross. When we consider the power, the glory of Christ, we might not believe that his power and strength shows itself most clearly at Calvary on the cross. But that's exactly what St. Paul writes. This cosmic reconciliation made possible by Christ was accomplished on a rough tree and a gruesome death by crucifixion. And that's a perfect segue to the gospel passage for today. Now, if we're going to talk about a king, likely we wouldn't talk about their execution. Like, that's why we know this is the king. He was executed. But that's exactly where the Gospel of Luke takes us on this Christ the King Sunday. The rule of Christ is not fueled by anything except the power of love, and love that is strong enough to willingly suffer in our place, a love that disarms the power structure and the systems of this world by sheer, pure, enduring love. Both the Colossians passage and the Luke passage relate that Christ's reign comes in the shape of a cross. Luke doesn't go into details of the crucifixion. He doesn't need to, because in his day it was so common. It was a torturous death, as hands and feet were nailed to wood. It was a shaming death, as stripped victims were on display as they struggled to lift their bodies, trying to take in a breath, their exposed flesh rubbing against the rough wood every time they would try to lift. And people would walk by, like people here during the Jim Crow era and before would sometimes come out almost as if it was a public holiday for a lynching. People here would come and watch crucifixion in a very morbid way of entertainment. That the incarnate God would suffer so is a poignant picture of what deep love God had and has for humanity. But Luke focuses in on the communications that were happening there as part of the scene. A sign above the head of Jesus says in Hebrew and Greek and Roman, "This is the King of the Jews." It's an inscription, and I can say that word, though I didn't prove it earlier. An inscription just set me off there. But anyone passing by, whatever language they spoke, could see that this man declared himself to be a king. And anyone who declares themselves a king or is recognized by others as a king has set themselves up against Caesar and his kingdom. And so the crucifixion was used as a way to depersonalize people and put them down. Don't ever try to be more than you are. The leaders mocked them. He saved others, let him save himself if he's the Messiah. And those around cast lots for his clothing. And that's an ultimate depersonalization. To say the external garment that someone has on is worth something, but the person, let them hang there and die, worth nothing. Even the other two sentenced to death mocked him. And in the other Gospels, we see that they both mocked him. But here, Luke speaks of a change in one of them. One of the men being crucified stopped mocking. He stopped demanding that if Christ truly was the Messiah, he would save them. He could not see any way out but a show of power. Let me rephrase that. The one who's mocking could see no way out except a show of power, using the world's systems to save. So the one that is mocking Jesus wants Jesus to use the kind of power that's being used against them in retaliation. This is what he's asking for. If Jesus has power, then use it to save them. So he is not liking where he is, but he is accepting these are the world's powers, and this is the only power there is. But the other thief saw something beyond that desperate moment, a glimpse of who was beside him, this Jesus. And he rebukes the mocking man. And turning the conversation toward Jesus, he asks to be remembered when Jesus comes into his kingdom. He recognized that this bloodied, naked, dying, suffering Jesus is a king. While others declared Jesus as a miracle worker or teacher or even Messiah in response to the wonders that he had performed and the wisdom he had shared, Here, where the systems of this world and Christ collided, only a dying thief was there to confess him as Lord. I wonder what he saw that enabled him to see what everyone else around was missing. The strength of Jesus' love that evidenced concern, perhaps. The forgiveness coming off the lips of the tortured one for those that were torturing him, enacting such cruelty against him, and forgiving those who mocked and jeered him. Whatever drew him, he saw the truth that others could not. Christ is the King. He might have had the timing off because he asked Jesus to remember him when he came into his kingdom. And that very moment was actually the coronation of Christ's ceremony to kingship. That very moment, the cosmos was claiming his kingly victory, that love overpowered hate. Nothing the world did or does, no matter how cruel, could prevent Jesus from being the King of love, the King of compassion, the King of forgiveness, the King of redemption, because Christ is the King. And then there's this tender moment when Jesus answers the dying thief that he will be with him through the dying and beyond in paradise. Something cosmic happened at Calvary, something of enormous magnitude. But while Jesus suffered incredibly to accomplish salvation for the world, for you and for me, he also took time to care for that one person right next to him who's reaching out to him for help. Jesus offered hope and a future to someone who felt there was no hope or future to be had, to be received. That man found salvation in the midst of crisis when life was quickly draining from him. He saw, he recognized, he pleaded with the King for a place in that kingdom. While Golgotha is a picture of human depravity and the depths of hatred and the callousness of the world and its powers, it is also a picture of God's love that goes to such extremes to redeem us, to bring us back into a reconciled, loving relationship with God. And somehow there, that thief saw an invitation. When bad things happen to me, I don't always recognize it as an invitation, but that man in that moment saw that Christ was King and saw the invitation for himself in that. When the world seemed helpless and when he seemed helpless and the world seemed hopeless, Christ the King was next to him, a fellow sufferer. With love so powerful, it promised a future. Can you imagine a future for someone who's being crucified? But Christ is King, and he has a future to offer. When the world seems dark, and sometimes it does seem dark, my water here. When the world seems scary, and sometimes it is scary. When it seems like there's no love to be found, no hope to be found, when everything seems wrong, when imagining a future feels impossible, when drawing even the next breath takes every effort you can muster, look next to you because Christ is there, the King. It says in 1 Peter chapter 3, set Christ in your heart as Lord. Christ the King God with us. We know him not to be king because he's so highly exalted, he's unreachable or unattainable. He is God with us. We know him as king because he's in the dark and low places. Can you see the king? Can you hear the invitation? The dying thief rejoiced to see salvation in his day. And there may I, though vile as he, wash all my sins away. Wash all my sins away. Wash all my sins away. And there may I, though vile as he, wash all my sins away.